All right. Well, let me ask you some questions about things that we have discussed previously before we get into new things tonight. First and foremost, not foremost, but first, um, what two things is an oral buyer agency agreement always in North Carolina? Suppose if you throw the third, there's technically a third, but there's two that I'm really focused on. But if, of course, if you give me the third, I'll give you partial credit for that. Cheyenne, that's the third. Express. They have to be clearly stated. Remember what I told you. Oral buyer agency agreements do have to be clearly stated. So if you got a test question that said oral buyer agency agreements would have to discuss whether or not we can do dual agency, how we're going to be compensated, and things like that, that is a true statement because we've got to talk the terms. That is part of that express, okay? It means clearly stated. So that is true. There you go. There's one of the other ones I was looking for, Lena. Non-exclusive, meaning an oral buyer agency agreement can never bind them to work with you and only you. And then Ashley gave me the other one, open-ended. What does that mean, open-ended?
There's no cutoff date.
Yeah, no time associated with it. They can really cancel anytime, right? It's not like, oh, this is only for 10 days. Oh, this is what no, it's happening until it's not. Either party, the agent or the buyer could cut it off whenever they wanted to. They could go on for a period of time. When would it have to be put into writing though? What would be the trigger for it having to be put into writing? Yeah, putting in an offer. You cannot submit an offer on behalf of a buyer client with an oral buyer agency agreement. So you would have to reduce it to a written buyer agency agreement prior to presentation of an offer. Or if you wanted to bind them to work with you and only you, right? Making it exclusive. You could only do that in writing as well. Well, I kind of gave you some advanced discussions last week. And so could you put in an offer on behalf of a buyer that refused to sign a written buyer agency agreement? There you go. Yes, as a seller subagent. You've got to be careful with the questions. I said put in an offer for them. I didn't say represent them. Is it possible to put in an offer for a buyer that refuses to sign a buyer agency agreement? Yes, but you would be acting as a seller subagent. Remember, North Carolina, you got to have a person. So it's not the buyer. The only other person it could be is the seller. Now, I told you that is not advisable in any way, shape, or form because even in an oral buyer agency agreement, they were your client and you owed them old car. But the second they won't sign that, if you turn into a seller subagent, you would now owe all those secrets that you learned about them to the seller. So not advisable, but technically something that can happen. Okay. So how about this? What is the definition of dual agency? Ashley says representing both the buyer and the seller. Yeah, so I've got a lot of different answers here. Firm representing both parties, people being worthless, buyer agent and seller agent in the same firm. Yeah, I mean, all of this is true, but you just got to be careful. These words matter so much. So just so we're on the same page, it has to be the same transaction. And of course, that's implied in some of your statements here, but you got to be very careful because what you'll see on the test is questions like which of the following would be an example of dual agency? And one of the answers will be a firm that works with buyers and sellers. Don't you ever pick that one. That is not dual agency. It has to literally be the firm representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, right? ABC Realty is representing the seller of 123 Main Street, ABC Realty is representing the buyer who wants to buy 123 Main Street. It's got to be the same transaction, very specifically. Also be very careful, because if we've got two brokerage firms, we can never, ever, 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 ever have dual agency. It's impossible. Dual agency is in-house transactions only. Okay, if there's two brokerage firms, we can never have dual agency. But oddly enough, we could potentially have exclusive representation with two brokerage firms if, yet again, what was present? Two brokerage firms in a transaction, but it's just exclusive representation. What would have to be present for that to be the case? There you go. Cooperating seller subagency means two firms are cooperating together, but one has been given the authority to act as a seller subagent. Why is that exclusive representation? Because both firms are loyal to whom? The seller. And the buyer is unrepresented. So you got to be very careful. Also remember, when you see things like selling never tells us where our loyalties are. That's a very dangerous word. It just tells us that you're assisting a buyer. We would need words like client or customer to give you a little more insight as to whom you represent. What are the three types of listing agreements we talked about? Open, exclusive agency, and exclusive right to sell. Gotta be very careful, okay? Because that word exclusive is in two of them, okay? How does open work? You hire several brokerage firms. You can be with several people. Yeah, there you go. Whoever brings the buyer gets the commission. Yep. Several brokerage firms are hired. That's that open aspect of it. Only the one who actually finds the buyer would be entitled to compensation. And what's the other really big kicker in open agency agreements? There you go. The seller has the right to find their own buyer as well and do for sale by owner. And if they find their own buyer, they're not paying any brokers nothing. Okay, well, how does an exclusive agency listing agreement work?
There's only one firm, but the seller can still represent themselves independently.
There you go. The exclusive piece is only one brokerage firm has been hired, and they're going to put forth their best marketing efforts to try to find a buyer. And if any of their marketing efforts brings a buyer, right, then the firms are going to get paid. But yet again, the seller retains the right to sell it themselves. And if they find their own buyer, they're not paying the brokerage firm anything. And then the last one, the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. How does that work? There you go. Broker receives commission regardless of who sells the property. So there's just this one brokerage firm hired yet again, but it does not matter where the buyer comes from. If there is a buyer, a ready, willing, and able buyer, we are getting paid. If it, we can offer terms acceptable to the seller. Obviously, that was the big kicker part there. But if the seller finds their own buyer, we get paid. If we find the buyer, we get paid. If the other firm finds them, we get paid. Doesn't matter where they come from, we still get paid. Of course, the exclusive right to sell being the most common in there. What did I tell you that one section of the listing agreement when we looked at it that basically ensured that you got your commission even after the listing agreement ended? And this is going to be present in the buyer agency agreement when we'll look at it later. But what did we call it that said, okay, well, hey, if you try to sell it to somebody we introduced to you, during the agreement, after the agreement is ended, within this period of time, you still may owe us our commission. What do we call that? I gave you 3 names. Protection period, tail clause, and extender clause. There you go. That's it. Those 3. Those are national topics, right? We call it a protection period in North Carolina, but from a national point of view, they'll very commonly use the term tail clause or extender clause to add in that protection. Of course, we also talked about other things on that listing agreement, like the triggers. Remember, what entitles us to our commission, meaning when have we earned our fee? When we have procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller. It's not getting any offer. That's not enough, folks. $1 offer, a $200 offer, a $200, not enough. It's got to be an offer that is either matching what the seller said they were going to get on the listing agreement or exceeding it, or the sellers would have had to have said, yes, this is satisfactory. So that is the trigger. And then, of course, we typically get paid at closing. Let me throw you an advanced one. What did I say? What 4 things did I say have to be present in every written agency agreement in North Carolina?
Expiration date.
Definite expiration date. Signed by all parties.
License numbers.
The individual broker's license number.
And a non-discrimination clause.
There it is. The non-discrimination provision, right? The broker will act without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, all of that fun-filled jazz. All right, one last question before we get into new material. What is a protection agreement? Remember, Anthony, words matter. Say again, Tara?
Commission in a for sale by owner.
There you go. I always like to bring that up because I told you students like to confuse the protection period with the protection agreement. I told you the protection agreement is something completely different. That is utilized when you are assisting a buyer client in purchasing a for sale by owner. And so it is a protection agreement in 2 facets. It reminds the seller, because you have to disclose that initial contact, right? If you're a buyer's agent already and you were talking to a seller or seller's agent, agency disclosure has to happen at initial contact. But it also reminds them, hey, we don't represent you. We represent the buyer, and you have agreed to pay us this compensation. Sign here. That is that protection agreement. I told you the legal name of the document in North Carolina is called the Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement. But for whatever reason, they like to dumb it down and just call it the protection agreement. So then, of course, we got into some commission math at the end of class last week, and we said the math itself is not overly difficult because it's just percentages. The biggest thing is keeping the parties straight and making sure you break it apart and you kind of keep track of who is getting paid what. And so there's several practices in that math packet that you're able to kind of look at and go through. So let me introduce another thing, and this is also on the listing side. We haven't switched to the buyer agency side yet, even though we've had some discussions on the buyer side stuff a little bit. Don't group this with the other ones, though, because it's not really on the same level. This is not really talking about how we represent them. It is something that dictates the way we're getting paid. It's called a net listing. A net listing. Folks, what does net mean? Like for yeah, there you go. Now we're getting the bottom line after some form of fee, after taxes, or after expenses. All of these things is kind of what I was getting for, net. Of course, there is a literal net as well, but we're talking about net, like after expenses. And so a net listing is a very unique one, folks. If you saw in the normal listing agreement, we put in what we expected to make, and it was some type of percentage of the sales price, or we could choose a flat fee. A net listing is neither. It is a listing where the seller says, well, hey, I need to hit a certain number. And this agreement basically would state that if whatever we can sell the property for in excess of what the seller says they need, we're entitled to keep. Now, listen to me very carefully, because when you think about this, your brain probably says does not compute or not good, no bueno, but you have to listen very carefully. It is not illegal. So if you get a test question that says, is it illegal? The answer is no. There is no law that says that we cannot use a net listing. However, due to the potential for impropriety, they are highly discouraged. So let me give you two examples, one that would be okay and one that's probably going to get you in trouble. If you met with a seller who just needed to get rid of their house because they were having trouble making the payments, and they said, I just need to sell it for enough to pay off all my loans. And let's say that they owed $250 and you knew you could easily sell the house for $450. And if you talk them into signing a net listing and the hopes that, you'd sell it for $450, they'd get $250, you'd get the other $200,000, you're going to be in big old trouble because you did not look after your client's best interest. You took advantage of them. That's going to be a problem. The listing agreement in and of itself is not illegal, but the way that you handle things is going to get you in trouble from a legal point of view. Let me tell you why these exist, though, that it would not be a detriment to the client. I had the property, and I think I probably told y'all about it one time, that I listed, that I couldn't even sell it for what they owed on it, really and truthfully. I mean, I tried, and it just was such a pain in the butt. And so there are times where maybe, you're in a situation where you're going to help a seller out and help them sell a property, but you know that you may or may not even be able to sell it for what they owe on it. And so let alone adding a commission to it is probably not going to work out because they may not have it. So we may decide to take it as a net listing to be nice and say, okay, well, listen, I may or may not be able to get what we owe. And if I do get it or a little bit above, I'll just take whatever is above that. And in that instance, we're making less than what we would say would be our normally desired commission probably. And so that's helping the client, not hurting them. And that's not going to get us in trouble. So is a net listing illegal? No. But is there a high likelihood for impropriety because of the way that this can be utilized? Absolutely. Just be very careful on the test. Okay. It's called a net listing. Now let me rehash something with you that I've said. Brad says, do you need to get the firm's blessing before doing that? More than likely, yes. It really just depends on the firm and the firm's policies, but more than likely, probably. Folks, let me explain something to you here for a second. And I've said this a few times, but since you're fresh today, I'm going to try to explain it yet again. I've told y'all multiple times throughout this class, do not feed into anything that is happening in the news or in discussions currently for realtor stuff. Okay, just don't do it because it will screw you up on the test. The biggest thing I've explained to you is oral buyer agency agreements are legal in North Carolina. And if you answer anything other than that, you're going to get the questions wrong. And so once upon a time, meaning just as recently as August, folks, when we were utilizing the MLS, you probably all heard of that. It stands for the Multiple Listing Service. It was always two things. I'm going to teach you what it always was because I'm telling you, no test questions have been rewritten yet. And so you still need to approach the test as this is factual, even though arguably it's not. The MLS always served as a marketing tool and a blanketed compensation agreement. A marketing tool and a blanketed compensation agreement. And so what we would do is we would advertise homes in the multiple listing service and other members could go in and see them. And we would put all the features of the home and the details and the price. And when I say it was a blanketed cooperation or compensation agreement as well, we would always put the compensation in the MLS. So when I listed a home, it would say buyer agency compensation, 2.4, 2.5, 3, whatever. And then it would also say seller subagent compensation 2.4, 2.5, 3. And the reason why I'm changing different numbers is it depends on the market. Some markets would be 2.4, some would be 2.5. Sometimes it depends on the type of property. And so what that meant was if a buyer agent looked in the MLS and they had a buyer client interested in my home that I listed and they wanted to put in an offer, they could look in there and they could see, oh, okay, Seth's firm is offering me 2.4% if we get under contract on that house. And because we were both members, we had this agreement to automatically share the compensation as such. And so they'd submit an offer, we'd get under contract, and we would share that compensation with them. Does that make sense for everybody? And so this is where I'm telling you too, if we wanted to know if we could act as a seller subagent, we look in the MLS because the MLS would state whether or not they were paying seller subagency compensation. If they were paying it, that means yes, they were allowing it. If they weren't, it means they were not. And so if they were not allowing seller subagency, then I was not going to be able to act as a seller subagent. It was either buyer agent or I'm not in it. And so I still want you to approach the test that way because these questions have not been rewritten. It is not trying to trick you on the test if it says there's compensation in the MLS. We just haven't rewritten the questions because I told you this stuff isn't even finalized yet. And so it's just a very weird time to have these discussions. That being said, to fully understand what has changed, don't worry about this for your test, but just so we're all on the same page, yeah, in August, they removed financial compensation from the MLS. It's not in there anymore. And now if we want to know what kind of compensation is being offered, we have to reach out to the agent and ask. So I have a listing right now and it's been shown a lot this weekend and I got a lot of texts. Hey, are y'all offering buyer agency compensation? I can text them and answer immediately. It's just not allowed to be anything that's affiliated with the Association of Realtors like the MLS is. That's part of the settlement. But for the sake of the test, the MLS, just answer it like it still does what it used to do. Is everybody with me? Which, as a perfect segue, leads us into discussion on antitrust laws, which is the whole basis of the Association of Realtors, lawsuits, and the things that you might be hearing, and the reason why some of these things changed. Folks, the antitrust laws, more specifically referred to as the Sherman Antitrust Act, is a big piece of federal legislation that basically dictates open commerce and competition in the market to keep prices aligned. And so it clearly states that there are certain things that are prohibited practices, and they are subject to very big fines and jail time if you violate any of these. And this is the argument that some of these antitrust laws were violated by the MLS having a semi-standard kind of outlook on compensation. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant, but that's the way they kind of look at it. So the things that are prohibited under the Sherman Antitrust Act, also just called antitrust laws for short, group price fixing, group boycotting, and group allocation of markets. And so let me just paint a picture for you in the real estate world, folks. Imagine that the head honcho from a Coldwell Banker office, the head honcho from a Keller Williams office, the head honcho from a Century 21 office, Allen Tate, Remax, whoever in a market area, met up one day, and in this meeting, all these head honchos looked at each other and said, well, hey, listen, okay, times is tough, inflation is real, okay, and we're all having to shell out money hand over fist. So why don't we all agree that we will all charge 7% on all of our commissions? And that way, if we're all charging it, there's no other options and people will have to pay it and we'll all make more money. That would be group price fixing. They're colluding to set prices that would be highly illegal, subject to really big fines and jail time. They don't play around with this stuff, okay? Now imagine in that same meeting, they said, well, yeah, while we're at it, why don't we all agree that we will not show ABC Mom and Pop Realty's listings and we won't let them show ours because they regularly take listings at 4%, and that's going to be really hard for us to compete with if we're all doing 7%, and they're so small they'll go out of business if we just don't allow them to show our listings. that would be group boycotting, because they sat there and they said, this one individual, we're not going to work with them. We're not going to allow them to work with us. We're going to single them out so they go out of business. That would be group boycotting. Highly illegal. Okay. Not allowed. And then the last one, group allocation of markets. In that same meeting, and they say, well, listen, why don't we just get out of each other's way? Why don't you just get this zip code and I'll get 27572 and you get 27603 and I'll get 27553. And then that way we don't even really compete with each other. That would be group allocation of markets. Also illegal, also subject to very big penalties. Now, just for funsies, I always like to ask this and see how froggy you are feeling. Do you think meetings like this are actually happening? It's always so funny to see the two types of people, right? Yeah, right. There's some of you who are like conspiracy theorists and some of you who are semi-realists. And I could see immediately who is who. Folks, they're not. I mean, these really are not happening. Yeah, there's competition in real estate markets, but it's friendly competition. And there's not doing meetings like this. Now, let me explain something though. Yeah, a group chat, right? They're not meeting in 2024. It's just a group chat nowadays, right, Jack? Nobody needs to physically meet anymore. They're just on Zoom. There you go. Just like this. Folks, let me explain what this really looks like, because I gave you an example to help you understand this, but I want you to imagine that Lena calls me up and Lena says, well, Seth, hey, I need to sell my house. I said, great, Lena, I'll be happy to help you. And so I meet Lena at her house and we start discussing all the things we're going to do to market her property and what it's going to look like and everything in between. And then, of course, she wants to know the big question. She's like, well, how much are you going to charge me, Seth? And I look at Lena and I said, well, Lena, I'm going to charge you 6%. And here's what Lena says, right? Lena says, oh my God, that's crack prices, Seth. Good Lord, you want my left kidney and my firstborn child too? 6%. Well, just stab me while you're at it, right? She just thinks that is just astronomically high. And here's what I say to Lena. I said, well, hold on, Lena. That's what everybody's charging. Right there. That is a violation of antitrust laws. Because if I say that's what everybody's charging, then I'm implying that we have talked about it. Even though I have not had this meeting. Even though I don't know what everybody else is charging. If you are dealing with, anything like this, and you say that's the going rate, that's the customary rate, that's anything like that, then you are potentially guilty of violating antitrust laws. Okay, you can say that's what my firm charges because that's just one business. Now, let me circle back. Beverly, you're talking about the settlement that I keep referring to? Oh yeah, I'm very aware of it.
Sorry.
I already kind of told you this is it's nothing new, Beverly. It's a money grab more than anything because people have always really known how this works, and the argument for that one was that this individual felt like he was told he had to pay a buyer's agent. And that was the whole stemming of the conversation, is because, what I told you on the listing agreement, if I was to charge a seller 6%, and this is why it's kind of a malarkey thing, because of the way we do it in North Carolina, we tell the sellers in North Carolina, I'm charging you 6%, and then I'm sharing 3 of that with the buyer's agent. So we weren't ever telling them that they had to pay a buyer's agent. We were saying we're charging you and we're paying a buyer's agent because that's the way it's done. And so the argument was in other states where they didn't do it so clean, that sellers felt like they were told they had to pay a buyer's agent, when in reality, that would imply that there is a standard, which means that prices are fixed, which means we did violate antitrust laws. And that's kind of the whole reason for that lawsuit. Was the argument was that the National Association of Realtors was the longest running antitrust violation that was legal until they realized that maybe it wasn't. Now, neither here nor there. I really don't think that it was fair to call it an antitrust violation because people have always been allowed to negotiate. I think that they were really concerned that there wasn't enough transparency. Ironically enough, though, what they did has created even less transparency.
Oh.
And so there's a lot of buyers and sellers getting screwed over because agents are allowed to say things when people call and they say, well, what are you offering in compensation? There are a lot of agents saying things like depends. Why are they saying that? Because they're going to try to pocket more money for themselves because they don't have to tell anybody up front what they're offering and sharing. So it has not helped the industry in any way, shape, or form. They really cut their own
Nose.
Yeah, it was bad, but whatever. I think they'll realize it, and somebody will try to change it again because it has just been an absolute cluster, for lack of a better way of putting it. Because there was zero guidance on. It said here's what you can and can't do. There was zero guidance on how to do it, and of course it's not pretty right now, but it's really hasn't changed anything except making more work and more uncertainty. But yeah, that was a thing. Still going. Let me clarify the other things that are actually antitrust violations, because I gave you the example of the price fixing. If you say things like that's a going rate, that's a customary rate, things like that, you're going to be in trouble. Folks, have you ever heard of somebody having a bad experience with like a lender or anything like that? Yeah, happens all the time. And so if my client was to have a bad experience with a lender or an attorney, if I was to go on social media, as everybody loves to do, and get in the little soapbox and say something like, oh my God, you should never use such and such lending. They're the worst people in the entire world. Nobody should use them because your clients are going to get to close. That could be considered group boycotting as well, because it's a rallying call from another professional to not use a certain provider or service. And then, of course, group allocation of markets, not something that very commonly is going to be violated. That one can't really accidentally be done. And so it's less of an issue. So anytime there's discussions on, oh, that's the going rate, that's the customary rate, or there's collusion to set prices, or everybody charges the same, that would be called price fixing. Big violation. Group boycotting, not using certain insurance providers, not using certain brokerages, lenders, attorneys, any businesses. Folks, these laws exist kind of like the same of no monopolies. And yes, if you didn't know this, monopoly is not just a game. It means a business that has full control of a certain product or, something like that. And so the reason that exists is because we're a capitalist market and a free trade market where competition keeps prices in line. Somebody can have a cell phone service and charge what they want, and then somebody else can have one and charge what they want. And so, sure, you can get $120 a month with this provider, or you can get $1,500 or $15 a month with, Ryan Reynolds or whatever. Competition is supposed to keep the market in line. And that's kind of the whole purpose of these antitrust laws. And they take them very seriously, obviously. And these are definitely going to be testable, right? So you got to keep these straight, especially because there's other laws that we're going to get into in a moment that your brain is going to try to group similarly, but I'll kind of point out the difference here. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, no price fixing, no boycotting, and no allocations of markets.
So, Seth, based on your example, a group is established by more than one broker, correct? Like more than one firm?
Yes. So if going back to that example with Lena saying, oh my God, 6% is crack price. And I said, well, Lena, that's what my firm charges. It's 6%. Be very careful on the test, because the answer is almost always going to be it's negotiable, because brokerage fees are supposed to be legally negotiable. However, we're not required to negotiate, right? It's not a fixed price, but we're allowed to charge. So if I say, Lena, my firm charges 6, and that's what I'm going to charge you, and I say, point blank period, that's it, Lena is more than welcome to call up somebody else, right? And hire a different brokerage firm. That's kind of the piece there. I just can't say anything that implies that everybody charges this, or, this a going rate or a standard, anything like that. Kind of like with any business, right? If you call an HVAC technician to come out and fix your AC and he quotes you one thing, if you don't like it, you can call somebody else. Now, when I tell you severe penalties, I mean severe penalties, punishable with fines up to $100,000 for individuals and 3 years in prison. And then for corporations up to millions of dollars and triple loss value in civil suits. That's actually what happened. Triple loss is what we call treble damages. Treble is a fancy word for up to triple the damage that was caused, and that's what the NAR one was. They came up with some arbitrary number in this settlement that NAR was supposed to pay, and it was trebled, so it ended up being like 7 point something billion dollars or something like that. I mean, it's something crazy. So, as I said, you've got to know these different things. It would be violation of antitrust laws. And then, of course, the certain triggers like saying that's the going rate, that's the customary rate. And then I also told you, too, the way that you're going to have to approach it on the test, it's always negotiable. Okay? Always negotiable, but a firm does not have to negotiate. Also, please be aware that if you get a test question that says something like, broker A charged this seller 5% and then went and charged another seller 6%, they didn't do anything wrong. Understand that we are allowed to negotiate our fees up and down as we see fit. You are not in trouble because you charge somebody less than you charge somebody else. Folks, I have clients all the time who are selling and buying, and I will give them a much better deal because I'm getting 2 transactions with them versus somebody who's just selling. Sometimes I also make special deals with friends. It's just the way that the business works. And so don't ever get caught up in that hang up on the test where it says, did it for this much for this person, but then charge somebody else this much. That's not a problem. We are allowed to charge what we want to charge, just like any business. If you don't like it, you can go elsewhere. That's the whole purpose of the antitrust laws. What you got, Beverly?
Really quick, those fluctuations in price, does that have to be approved by the BIC, or like can the agent actually independently set those?
Kind of going back to, I think, what Brad asked earlier, it depends on the firm. Some firms have policies that you need BIC approval to fluctuate within that. Some will give you free reign. Like they will say, you can...
Anywhere between.
Yeah, you can go down to 5 without BIC approval, but anything less than that, you would need to, get your BIC's approval on it or something like that.
Okay.
So here's the other grouping of laws that I told you, you want to make sure you keep them straight because they're very different. Antitrust laws, big federal legislation that deals with, of course, the free market and free enterprise and things of that nature. And so it has those certain prohibited things. The next thing we're talking about is what we're going to call solicitation laws. Folks, what is solicitation? Cold calls would absolutely be an example of solicitation. Seeking business, bothering people, all of the above. I like it. Anytime you're trying to get business of somebody else. And so we've got several different solicitation laws that are testable. First, there is Article 16 of the Realtor Code of Ethics. Now, I've explained this a couple times, and we're talking about realtors right now in some respects, but remember, you are a broker because you get a North Carolina real estate broker's license. You're an agent because you represent the well-being of other people. And you are a realtor if and only if you join the National Association of Realtors. And historically, people have done that because it's been tied to the multiple listing service. And so most brokers do become realtors. When you join the Association of Realtors, there is a code of ethics. There are 17 articles within the code of ethics that kind of dictate how we operate. It's voluntary, but because you joined it, you have agreed to abide by these rules, or these code, if you will. And so Article 16 very specifically states that you cannot, should not, will not, all the above, try to steal business from other real estate professionals or other real estate brokers. Direct solicitation of other people's clients is a violation. You would get in trouble. And so this was actually mentioned on the listing agreement. And so we saw that that means that the agreement could start when we all signed it, or it could be future dated because you were already in a relationship with somebody. So if you ever get a question about this, if, there is a seller who is already represented by an agent and they call you up and they say, I hate my agent, I want to hire you, you can sign a listing agreement that is future dated when the other relationship ends. Okay, but you cannot do anything to try to steal business, right? Like try to convince them to fire their agent, try to talk them out on how to get out of it or anything like that. If you do anything of that nature or badmouth the other agent, you could be in violation of Article 16 of the Realtor Code of Ethics. Aside from that, even if you are not a realtor, if you try to steal business from other people, agency agreements are contracts. And so you can be sued in court if you try to help somebody get out of a contract because it's tort law, civil law, right? Tortious interference of a contract. Now, the other two really prominent solicitation laws that are going to be testable is the Do Not Call Registry and the CAN-SPAM Act, folks. Now, be careful because I'm telling you, I see the mistakes that students make day in and day out. And so before I even teach them to you, let's play a fun game. If I'm talking about the Do Not Call Registry, or in other words, Do Not Call legislation, what type of solicitation do you think it's dealing with?
Phone.
Phone calls. It's in the name. Okay, let's try this again. Now, think back to the origin of the word, not what you consider it to be today. If I'm talking about the CAN-SPAM Act, what do you think I'm talking about? What type of solicitation do you think I'm talking about? Emails. Spam folders originated in email accounts. Okay. And so I cannot tell you how often students will answer CAN-SPAM Act for phone calls. Don't you do that. It is in the name. The Do Not Call legislation deals with solicitation by way of phone calls, and the CAN-SPAM Act deals with solicitation by way of email. I'm going to teach you the things you need to know about them. Now, there's another one that's not in my slides that may or may not come up on the test called the Junk Fax, F-A-X, Junk Fax Prevention Act. What type of solicitation do you think that deals with? Yeah, Terry
Junk
knows.
mail.
Yeah, say it again.
Junk mail.
Not junk mail.
Access.
Faxes.
Junk mail.
Faxes. Yeah, that's still a thing. I know,
People
Brooks.
still do that.
Yeah, I know. Faxes. The Junk Fax Prevention Act deals with solicitation by way of faxes. And folks, there's not a single one of you in this room that will ever violate the Junk Fax Prevention Act because ain't nobody got a fax machine no more. And if they got one, they ain't got no landline. All right? Yeah, you got a landline, Brooks? All right, well, fossil. Get your life together, man. It's not like you're going to use it, but you have one. Yeah, there you go. So let's start with the Do Not Call legislation now that I've kind of, spoken my piece with the names and how literally they help you understand what they're about. Folks, the Do Not Call registry in a nutshell states that if you put your name on a Do Not Call list, then businesses should be checking that list before they try to solicit your business by way of phone calls. And so there are penalties and fines if a business reaches out to somebody to solicit and their number is on the Do Not Call list. That's what it comes down to. Now, of course, what that means is if you have not put in your number on the Do Not Call list, you're fair game. They can call you. There's not penalties for that. However, they are supposed to maintain a in-house Do Not Call list. So if you say, don't call me again, they're supposed to keep a record of that, even if you're not on the actual Do Not Call list. But what's going to be more testable than anything is the exemptions to the Do Not Call list. In other words, times where you could call somebody, even if they are on the Do Not Call list. So exception number one, exception number one, is if you have had a business relationship with them within the past 18 months, you can call them. So if I say, broker A helped Sergio close on a house, 10 months ago, which of the following is true in regard to the Do Not Call list. That agent can call Sergio and solicit more business from him because they've had a business transaction in less than 18 months. 10 months is less than 18. It's up to 18 months. So business relationship within the past 18 months, you can call them even if they're on the Do Not Call list. The other thing is if they've done an inquiry on your business pages, sharing their information with you within the past 3 months. So you haven't done business with them, but they've given you their information on a business page within the past 3 months. You can call them. Couple more that could potentially show up on the test. If you have a personal relationship to this person, if they're your best friend, your sister, your mother, your grandmother, your aunts, uncles, nieces, nephew, if you got some type of personal relationship, you can call them, even if they're on the do not call list. If somebody gives you a direct invitation to call them, then you can call them even if they're on the do not call list. You should keep a copy of that invitation. Now, one other one that you have to be very careful of on the test, folks. If we're dealing with a for sale by owner, and a for sale by owner is not on the do not call list, because they're not on it, you could call them and try to solicit their listing. But if a for sale by owner is on the do not call list, you are not allowed to call them unless you have a buyer client interested in that property. Because then you're not calling for solicitation. You're calling because you have an interested buyer. But you better not talk about trying to sell their house in any way, shape, or form, because that could get you in trouble. And of course, there are some pretty big penalties and fines here. Federal fines go up to $11,000 for violations on a federal, national level. And then, of course, at a North Carolina state level, depending on how often you've done it, if it's been multiple times, if there was ill intent, it can go anywhere from $500 to $5,000 for these fines for violating the do not call legislation. So that's the biggest piece of the do not call list in a nutshell, right? If there aren't names on the list, you can't be called to solicit unless you meet one of those exceptions. And then, of course, if you're not on the list, you can still be solicited. So just be careful with the questions. So then the next one is the CAN-SPAM Act. And of course, you are familiar with spam emails. And so it does have to deal with email solicitation. I always like to warn people that it's email because that's where it originated. Even though your phone now calls stuff spam as well, that word has kind of just started becoming a synonymous with a nuisance or a robocall or something like that. But CAN-SPAM Act deals with emails. Now, what you may not realize is that CAN-SPAM, CAN-SPAM, is actually an acronym. And it stands for, ready for this? Controlling the Assault of Non-Solicited Pornography and Marketing Act. Yeah, probably didn't know that. Folks, some of you are too young. Some of you remember the internet was a very interesting thing when it first came. Listen, it's still a very interesting thing. But every one of us got email addresses, and we almost immediately got all kinds of weird stuff in our email inboxes, folks. And it was wild. Nothing but nonstop porn and people trying to sell you pills to make certain things do certain things, okay? It was a really weird time in the email world. And so this legislation was passed to control the assault of non-solicited pornography and marketing act. And so the biggest thing that came about from this was stating that if somebody is sending out mass emails to consumers for marketing purposes, they're allowed to do it. However, the email has to contain a conspicuous opt-out or unsubscribe notice. So if you're on Target mailing list or Starbucks mailing list or Walmart or anything like that, you're getting these mass emails. And if you look down at the bottom, every single one of them has to say unsubscribe here or something like that. Okay, that is the requirement. So when somebody unsubscribes or opts out, you stop sending them emails. Of course, this does not apply to one-on-one emails. This is mass mailers. What this means for us as real estate brokers would be just listeds, just solds, weekly newsletters that we may be sending out to large groups of like past clients or things of that nature. It's got to have that unsubscribe or opt out. Also, it has to contain the physical address of the company.